Okay, let's break down what's happening here. Basically, there's this think tank, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, NIESR, that's been analyzing what could happen to the UK economy if Donald Trump wins the US presidential election and puts these major tariffs in place. You know, those import taxes on goods coming into the US, right? So according to NIESR, if Trump goes through with these tariffs, a massive 60% on Chinese imports and 10% on everything else, it could lead to a significant trade war, and that would ripple through economies, including the UK. Yeah, so NIESR economist Amit Kaya explains that if Trump does go forward with these tariffs, the UK's economic growth could be hit hard. How hard? Well, Kaya says it could drop by 0.7 percentage points in the first year and another 0.5 percentage points in the second. And for an economy that's already growing slowly, those numbers aren't great. The UK, he says, is a small, open economy, so it's especially vulnerable to shocks like this. With less growth, inflation would rise, and the Bank of England would probably have to increase interest rates to keep things in check. I see what he's saying here. Without Trump's tariffs, NIESR predicts that the UK economy would grow by around 1.2% in 2025 and by 1.4% in 2026. Inflation would be closer to the government's 2% target, which is pretty normal. Plus, interest rates would come down from 5% to about 3.25%. But if those tariffs go through, well, the entire picture changes. Now, Kaya also mentions that if other countries hit back with their own tariffs, a tit-for-tat kind of response, it could actually make things worse. The US itself would feel the impact, with growth there dropping by 1.3% to 1.8% in the first 2 years, depending on how intense the retaliation gets. So in the end, the tariffs wouldn't just hit the UK but would also create a tougher economic situation for the US and any other economies involved. Now there's more to this too. NIESR recently analyzed the UK's budget, and they're not exactly optimistic about its long-term growth effects. The think tank's deputy director, Stephen Millard, shared his thoughts. Apparently, the increase in public infrastructure spending announced by Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is actually just covering up for the cuts made by the previous government. Millard says that while this is a positive move, it doesn't really push the economy forward in any significant way because it's essentially just balancing out past reductions. Also, Reeves made a change in how the government assesses the sustainability of the national debt. Yeah, it's a bit technical, but it basically means they're looking at the UK's financial assets and liabilities differently. Millard thinks this change might make room for more public investment, which could be a good thing, but then he adds that the actual impact will depend on timing and the amount invested. So yeah, he seems to be saying that while it's a step in the right direction, it might not be enough. Oh, and there's this interesting bit about the national insurance contributions too. With the budget, the rate that employers pay is set to increase. That's going to put a bit of a strain on job creation, potentially raising unemployment over the next few years. So you've got a mix of good and bad here: higher GDP growth and inflation because of increased demand, but a possible downside with employment as companies feel the pinch from higher costs. Now, NIESR also highlights the income tax freeze and how it's affecting lower-income households. Reeves decided to extend the freeze on tax allowances and thresholds until April 2028, which means that people's incomes will essentially get pushed into higher tax brackets as inflation and wage growth continue. For the UK's poorest families, this means an extra PS600 a year in taxes. Not a small sum if you're already struggling. This is where Adrian Pabst, another deputy director at NIESR, brings in his point. He argues that this freeze on tax thresholds is actually making things tougher on lower-income households, the ones that have already been hit hard by the cost of living crisis. And the numbers are shocking. Families in the lowest income bracket have seen a 20% drop in their living standards between 2021 and 2025, which is around PS 2,500. The think tank thinks that living standards will slowly rise again, but it could take until 2026 just to get back to where they were in 2022. Pabst suggests that, instead of freezing tax thresholds, the government could have raised income taxes on higher earners and unfrozen the thresholds in 2025. He believes that would have been a fairer approach, helping the most affected households recover from the recent economic blows. It's a pretty direct call for action. He's saying it's time to move past austerity measures and consider the well-being of the economy and society as a whole. Right, so there's this clear theme from NIESR that the UK government has to balance fiscal responsibility with more equitable solutions. They see the long-term growth potential of the UK as just 1.2% per year, which isn't high, so they're saying it's time to address these structural issues. They're arguing that the government should maybe rethink its tax policies and invest more heavily in ways that would support both growth and social welfare. So yeah, if I had to sum it up, the report's really a call for proactive policy that can support growth without leaving the most vulnerable behind. It's fascinating stuff. Really, they're showing that these big decisions, whether it's tariffs from the US or national budgets in the UK, have real and often heavy consequences on everyday people and the economy as a whole.